is our last segment of the symposium. And if you're just joining us, let me just quickly reintroduce our speakers. To my left is Emeka Umeji. He's currently a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, and he is a media scholar. His presentation earlier was on the Belt and Road News Network. To his left is Maria Repnikova. She is currently associate professor at Georgia State University, and she's a scholar of global communication, focusing on China and Russia. And then our final speaker of the day was Vivian Liu, who is assistant professor at Fordham University, and she's a cultural anthropologist. So what I wanted to do in this last session was just put a few questions to our speakers and basically engage in a discussion. And they're also welcome to ask questions of one another. We'll bring the audience, both the in-person and virtual audience in as well for a Q&A session. But I wanted to kind of use this last session to really broaden out a little bit to talk about Chinese influence, Chinese influences on the continent, and kind of successes of their quote-unquote soft power initiatives on the continent. So maybe I can start with Maria, but again, anybody else who wants to answer this question is more than welcome. And you started addressing some of these questions in your presentation, but I want to kind of revisit this question of the effectiveness of Chinese media, and maybe more broadly, Chinese image making, soft power influence on the continent. Based on your research and other research papers that I've read, clearly the uptake of China Daily, even if it's kind of present everywhere, its uptake has been limited. We've seen studies from people like Anita Wheeler, who've written about Confucius Institutes, and while there is a proliferation of Confucius Institutes across the continent, the level of success they have in actually teaching Chinese language or kind of encouraging a greater popularity of Chinese soft power, if you will, has also been quite limited. And you started talking about Xinhua as a service, kind of like AP, that they're making themselves available. But I guess the question is, how successful has this kind of overall soft power project of the Chinese government been on the continent? It's been nearly 20 years now since the kind of really active engagement started. So maybe we can start with Maria, and if Emeka and Vivian also have responses, that would be great.
So, building from the initial comments on how do we think about the effectiveness of Chinese state media, and I guess it's larger project of soft power. I think we have to kind of step back and think about China's official motivations also for soft power at large, and why are they doing this? Why are they engaging in these initiatives? And I think it's a bit tempting to kind of compare or sort of transfer the concept from Joseph Nye to China and think, well, Nye, who's an American political scientist and former high-ranking official, thought of soft power in terms of attraction, right? One has to be attracted to something. It's a bit of an ephemeral kind of thing, but he doesn't really define it super closely, but he does talk about attraction to values, culture, and foreign policy. That's a very US-focused idea of soft power. But in Chinese reconceptualization of the concept, they have sort of stretched it out quite a bit and shifted what is really meant by soft power. So they see soft power in much more, I think, kind of practical orientations. They mix a lot of instruments together in terms of how to promote China's image. When you look at Chinese writings, they don't say just culture, values, and foreign policy. They talk about China's economic governance, technological prowess, just anything that boosts China's image is seen as part of soft power arsenals. That's just one thing. And the second thing, in terms of what they're trying to get out of it, the motivations, from my reading, it seems like a lot of focus is on recognition and respect as opposed to attraction. And those are very different goals, right? If you want to be attractive, quote unquote, somebody being attracted enough to you as a state, as an entity, to follow you, kind of to basically basically wanting to be like you. That's kind of the idea of Nai. I think in China's conceptualization, it's more about recognition, respect. So kind of, respecting and acknowledging publicly that China has accomplished a lot, that it's a great power. That seems to be a much more limited idea of what soft power is about. And if you think about success from that perspective, it seems like they are, in some ways at least, successful through their soft power project, because they do get public recognition from the participants in its initiatives. They do legitimize China, as I mentioned at the end, through these various mechanisms, whether it's interviews with Chinese domestic media, or arguably self-censorship about how they talk about China in domestic media. And what Emeka talked about really resonated with my research as well, this idea of being quite cautious about how China is represented. I see it as a self-control, self-censorship, and that also means that mostly what's being published is quite positive, right? It's recognizing, acknowledging China's success, and what it's doing in Africa is being, again, quite effective. So I think if we think about it from this kind of limited prism of recognition, it seems that China is getting somewhere, or at least it's getting something symbolically back. But if we think about more in terms of building trust or engaging public in its initiatives, that means people consuming Chinese media and engaging in Chinese culture on their own terms. I think in terms of state-sponsored kind of initiatives, it seems to be that effect is quite limited. It doesn't quite spread out beyond that particular prism, and we do see the Chinese state media is not taken up, very widely. And other studies that include surveys and interviews across different African countries that I've come across, they also talk about the interviews with journalists on the ground, with local journalists who don't seem to trust Chinese media, and they still rely mostly on Western sources. So it seems like even when it comes to a source and using it in the local writings, Chinese state media is not the primary source. It's often being distrusted, and it's the stories are mimicked when it comes to maybe certain China-Africa issues, but not more broadly or globally. So I think that maybe that distinction might be helpful to think about. What is China trying to accomplish? If it's respect and recognition, it seems like it's getting it on some level, at least publicly. If it's about trust and larger enticement, it seems like that's much more ambiguous. So thank you.
That wonderful response. I just want to add a bit. I think when Chinese media started expanding in Africa over a decade ago. Xinhua has been in Africa for more than 50 years anyway. So, but CGTN Africa was the first outpost for CGT, which used to be CGTV Africa. Africa was its first outpost before every other place. So I think Chinese media, the expansion agenda had two clear motives in Africa, so to speak. I mean, it based on what you have said. One of them was to, counteract the Western narrative of China-Africa engagement, which was, majorly framed as a predator-partner relationship, that China was in Africa to seek natural resources to power its economy. Then the second was to provide a learning curve for Chinese media expansion, Chinese media going out project. Then when we look clearly, we find out that the second objective has been achieved because, CGTN started in Africa and it's in the US. You have CGTN in America, we have CGTN in Europe, and Africa provided a very, very viable, space for it to learn, make mistakes, and correct those mistakes. It couldn't make those mistakes in the US or in the West because it would become, it would turn something of mockery, So they've made mistakes in Africa, corrected them, and they were able to expand, to the global north. In that regard, they succeeded. But in terms of, counteracting the Western narrative framing of China-Africa relation, they have not succeeded in that regard, even though they've tried, but because several scholars who have researched, and even some of the ones that we have done in recent times, we have seen that Chinese media has gained very limited traction with African audiences. So I think it's still a struggle for them, whether they will succeed. Well, one of the problems that they seem to have in Africa is that African people say, well, if this media cannot criticize their own leaders in their country, how do we trust them? So it's a problem of, Chinese domestic media outlook in China influencing how they are being perceived in Africa. Because, journalists tell you, how do I trust you? How do I trust what their media is saying? It's propaganda. We know every media does propaganda, but they're saying, well, this one, they can't even criticize their own people. They can't even criticize their political. Let's even go to Nigeria. In Nigeria, you can criticize Buhari and, and say whatever you want to say. The Buhari spokesman will only respond to you. Nobody's going to come to, so these are issues that seems to, hamper Chinese media attraction in Africa. Thank
you. So, this is kind of observational. But in terms of soft power effectiveness, I guess I don't know how to assess effectiveness necessarily, but I'm thinking about pervasiveness, and so from spending time or visibility and spending time in Nigeria, for example, Ghana, to in the last decade or so, different periods living there, I was just trying to think of like what have I seen just on background on people's televisions when moving around, and when there is Chinese state media. One thing that always struck me was it was less like, I don't think I saw news anchors or headlines from CGTN so much, but more in those agricultural, like kind of technical programming. So like there's a whole CCTV channel in China dedicated just to programming that features like farmers who are able to, I don't remember, but cultivate a certain kind of seed that is particularly successful, or a rabbit farmer and how he builds his little rabbit houses in a way that's efficient, or something like that. But they're very technical, kind of small scale, featuring farmers or specific projects, and that's the ones I've seen on occasion that will just be up, because they're I don't want to say boring, but they're just very like mundane. Like you could just have it on and then kind of observe some techniques. I don't know if people are actually learning from that necessarily, but it reminds me though that I think with these Chinese interactions, as both of you have been mentioning, there is this way that technology, or whether that's agricultural or machine based, right, is a really important site of spectacle for Chinese claims to being a moral or authoritative or developmentally interested figure. So that was just more observational, but what I've observed of the programming that makes it onto televisions that could just be playing on into the background from CC.
I have a related question, and it's probably more targeted at Maria and Emeka, who focused on Chinese media. But I guess I'm wondering, with China Daily, with Xinhua, with CGTN, who is their actual target audience? Who's the actual target audience? And I think I wrote this question as I was listening to Maria's talk. It seemed to me that there was a sort of circularity with the way that they used African media trips to China, right? So African journalists were invited to China, but then they were all interviewed by Chinese media, and to some extent, it seemed like it was a Chinese method of kind of rationalizing or justifying their engagement in Africa to Chinese audiences. So I guess I'm wondering, with these various different Chinese media outlets and exercises and initiatives like the Chinese, the Belt and Road News Network, who are they targeting? And what are they attempting to achieve on a larger scale? And maybe linked to that is this question of how are African audiences and African publics responding to this. And we heard from both Maria and Emeka about about African state and African state media kind of kowtowing to whatever the message is that the Chinese media are wanting to send. But in the different countries that you guys have studied, have you seen African audiences kind of push back a little bit? And I think somebody asked a question about African civil society organizations, but I'm kind of, so that's two questions. That's a lot, but please go ahead.
Well, for who are they targeting? Chinese state media. It's a very, 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 very critical question for the first time. But I think they are targeting African audiences in general. If you, but again, they are not in Africa to make money. They are not in Africa to achieve for advertising, because as of the time I did my fieldwork in Kenya, they were not accepting advertising from anybody. So which means that they don't care about, I mean, you bringing advertising to them. They are just there to, well, the Chinese people are here. If you like us, fine. If you don't like us, Hopefully Sunday you will like us. I hope so. Because the guys at CGTN told me that they have been asking for audience survey, but they have not. The management has not yielded to it. Yeah, they've never done it. So I mean, the guy was telling me that this is strange because we need to know people who are watching us. We didn't know, but we never had that done, right? So I don't know. So, but what I think is the media, the Chinese media organizations, state media organizations, they are more than just media organizations. They are also agents, economic agents, and political agents. Because the journalists tell you that we go to interview presidents, we want to establish relationship, we go there as also while we are doing the journalism work, we're also going there doing some form of businesses for China. So it's more than media. The symbolic, just that kind of a symbolic factor. Power play. China is here. We could do business. This media provides an opportunity for us to do business. I think that is what is even more important than any other thing there, right? So maybe that's why they don't care, because if you watch DSTV, when the DSTV goes off, the only channel that is left is CGTN. It's free most time. I don't know if it's still free. So it's just to get people to attracted. Then what do they tend to achieve? What they intend to achieve? I think they want to. One of the things people watch most on CGTN is the tourism programs. So you see Africa say, "Oh, I love China. The buildings, the place so beautiful," and that's something to be proud of. Most of them have never seen China before, but they see, "Oh, look at China. So China is this beautiful. I didn't know." So I mean, whether we agree or not, it's winning something. People are saying, "Oh, so we didn't know. We thought China was just one place everybody was locked in a room, and just the key." Oh, so now see people are even going to club. People are happy. People are celebrating. Oh, so people could celebrate in China. So whether we like it or not, something is happening, right? So the cultural programs are very, very they gain people in Africa like it. People like the sightseeing, those big programs, showing those. It's winning audiences in Africa, but not as we would expect from like Western media.
So just to build up on a few points that Emeka brought up, and I also really like the idea of pervasiveness that Vivian mentioned. It's interesting to think of soft power kind of effects. Of course, again, it's very hard to measure, but the idea of pervasiveness, like what are people watching and seeing everywhere? Like just observing the context, and of course, as an anthropologist, she's observing the different spaces, and I was also trying to observe that in my research, just seeing what's on the screens, like in the major spaces and private spaces, of what are people seeing. And I also didn't see a whole lot of Chinese media on screens, but I found that the similarity with what you brought up in terms of these technical programs. If you take like the light rail in Addis Ababa, they're always playing the technical programs about the light rail and about how it was signed. So there's some kind of mediums of I guess persuasion that are also entangled in like big technical projects. So if you're taking a certain kind of train or you're consuming Chinese technology in certain ways, you're also in some ways being exposed to something about China and kind of the spectacle of its, I guess, technological prowess. So I found that to be interesting. And although I didn't notice people actually watching the video too much, so maybe I was the only one. I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's on background, so it's like yeah, it's very liminal. So I was like, oh, I guess it's not really effective because nobody's really putting up their heads. Oh, this is a cool idea. I mean, I was the only one like staring at it and trying to take some notes, but it was just part of research. So yeah, I guess in terms of pervasiveness, how do we what counts as pervasiveness? But it's an interesting way to think about, I guess, the presence of Chinese soft power and the media. So just to build up on in terms of the who is the target audience, I think it's an interesting question, because if you think about Chinese soft power at large, it's not always very clear who the target audience is. It's not very well articulated, and I think there is a dual audience: as domestic Chinese audience, and of course the global audience, in this case the African audience. So there's definitely an interest in influencing and shaping public opinion about China, and I really agree with Emeka's point on beating narratives from the West. And there's so much emphasis on the West. When I was analyzing Chinese documents and official articles, so much discontent with how the West is presenting China in Africa, that it's wrong, it's biased, it's just inherently incorrect. So it creates misunderstandings. So one of the big goals of Chinese media is to basically battle those narratives. That's being very clearly articulated by Chinese scholars. So that was really interesting and speaks to Emeka's point also. But I think the domestic audience is really important as well. And what Wim brought up, this notion of convincing Chinese people that, hey, we're doing something right, and people are liking our programs in Africa, our projects, because not everybody in China agrees. I think there's a lot of discontent about China's investment in Africa, and it's being perceived as kind of gifting. that they're gifting, something away. And, also building on the points Emeka made in terms of Chinese state media, they don't need advertising, right? They're kind of operating through state budgets, but the Chinese public thinks that's a waste of money, right? It's like, why are they going out there and presenting all these things? But especially, why are so many students coming and living in really good conditions for free? And that creates a lot of resentment on social media and Chinese social media, and also various discussions. I don't think it's a very welcoming sentiment that we should be doing this kind of work. It's actually a suspicious sentiment. So convincing them about that is actually quite important for China's domestic legitimacy. So I do see domestic audience as a really important part of this whole, this whole project. And in terms of pushback, you asked about the pushbacks in civil society. In the Ethiopian case, I didn't find a lot of pushback through mainstream media. It's very, very limited, and I often found that even in private media, the language would be extremely subtle. When there's certain critique, they just wouldn't mention China, but would talk about kind of anti-colonialism. So the words would come up that are quite strong, but China was not even in the title. So it was a very, clearly kind of self-censored portrayal. But at the same time, in popular culture, if you look at social media, there's a lot of critical content, and a lot of it is also, fused with stereotypes, all kinds of stereotypical positioning that one could argue is also racialized stereotyping that focuses on Chinese culture as being kind of exotified, or also is infiltrating Ethiopia's traditional culture. There's kind of the sense of coming in and somehow destabilizing the status quo. So very, very critical sentiments in popular culture that don't get represented in traditional or in official media. So that disconnect is interesting, but people are consuming a lot of popular culture. They're mostly on social media. So again, thinking about consumption, probably those messages are much more potent for them than whatever the official media is publishing about the projects and deals that are being signed.
To add on and think about film, which I'm still thinking about in relation to these these other frames, but in terms of film, these big kind of Chinese blockbusters or whatever have you that are again oftentimes state sponsored. I think precisely there is that kind of double-edged audience, both domestic and foreign, and you see that really strongly. I know I actually haven't seen the film Wolf Warrior 2, but I've heard a lot about it. If you are interested, people have written about it. Yeah, so it's a film that, from what I understand, has a fictionalized African country, and there's a kind of basically Chinese military savior storyline. Yeah. Right, and so I've seen other ones like that. I was on a flight also recently. I forgot the name right now. I have it somewhere in my notes, but where it's kind of a similar storyline where you have basically a fictionalized African country. There is this kind of ongoing political chaos going on that you eventually figure out is a evil European woman who's kind of interested in extractive industries. And basically Chinese actors enter in as not on behalf of the Chinese state, but on behalf of the UN, alongside a few other kind of UN forces, but all the images of the Chinese soldiers are multiple it's Chinese, but also UN. I think it's UN or some kind of international body with a flag. So it's always this kind of idea that it's not China operating alone, but in tandem with some kind of broader international body. Which that I think is oriented both towards domestic and foreign. And lastly, one of the films, Jackie Chan films that came out in the last decade, I also forgot the title right now off the top of my head, but I remember I watched it with some Nigerians, and it was basically a storyline where as there's historically Chinese kind of different warlords fighting, not to spoil the film, but it basically culminates in a fight between kind of infighting, and then the end scene is basically European colonialists coming in and bombing all of them, or defeating all of them as they're infighting, which I think obviously has really strong domestic political commentary in contemporary China. This is, I guess, during kind of Uyghur, in the aftermath of Uyghur protests and all that. So, there's really strong commentary you're seeing through these films that are not even explicitly, I don't know, I guess they could be considered part of quote-unquote Chinese state soft power, but they don't seem as coherent with necessarily these themes or these other structures like the BRN explicitly in terms of journalist networks, etc. But you do see themes come out certainly in these big global blockbusters.
I think for me, one of the themes that's sort of emerging across the conversation that also goes back to Emeka's point about the success of Chinese state media in Africa, kind of opening up doors for the state media to go elsewhere, kind of going global through Africa. Something I also found in this analysis that I've been reading is that Africa is often presented as kind of a window or a passage point or a site to prove oneself to the world. So I think one of the audiences is definitely more global. It's not just African audiences, or not, I mean, just is the wrong word, but not only African audiences and Chinese audiences, but also just the world at large. It seems like there is a very high stake project there that if you do well there, in Africa, you're going to kind of position yourself to be presented or envisioned as a much more benevolent actor, as a well-received actor globally. So it's not just about convincing one set of audiences, but it's actually the whole world is going to be convinced and envisioned differently when it comes to China's overall image. So that's why they're also very sensitive when it comes to Western critiques, because if the West is critiquing China all the time and people are buying into it, then this whole project isn't working. So there's a real sensitivity around that. So I found that theme kind of cutting across very interesting about also the film, like Wolf Warrior. The audience is also global, and Africa is a fictionalized state there. They're using one particular state, but they're trying to target the world to showcase like here's who we are. This is what we're doing. So it's an interesting kind of passage point that's coming through for me in terms of the analysis here.
So in my classes, I've added a component, a session where we speak about media, arts, and cultural engagement. And one of the things that we haven't covered so far in this, but a kind of another element of media or journalism are political satirists and cartoonists. But I'm wondering if you guys have any insights about cartoonists in South Africa like Zapiro. A cartoonist named his real name is Jonathan Shapiro. He's kind of poked fun at not so much China, but African leaders' engagement with China, right? And in much the same way, artist Michael Soy, who's Kenyan, has come up with lots of very bright, colorful works that are very, very critical. So I'm wondering about kind of the role of African artists and cartoonists in perhaps voicing some of the concerns and critiques of not necessarily China as such, China as an actor, but certainly their African governments and African kind of Africa's relationship and perhaps complicity with China. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts about those.
What an interesting question. I think I was still in South Africa when Shapiro was Jonathan Shapiro, when he was dealing with Zuma, right? Yeah, but in Ghana we have a very big one in Ghana. I think I met him when I was in Ghana, when I was teaching at the University of Ghana. His name is Bright Aqua. So he's done a series of cartoon, which is anti-China actually. It was so bad that the Chinese embassy in Ghana had to express its displeasure. I think I have the article here. It says this cartoon by a Ghanaian artist has made China very unhappy. So he's very popular. So you see those things come up, and I mean when he did that, the Chinese embassy was not happy. They said he was misrepresenting President Xi Jinping. So so you have this kind of people, and I've seen his cartoons. It's not just one, a series of them. I mean there was one he made about China coming to eat. Something like a pot. China come to take over everything. From Africa. So this kind of narrative trying to show that China is a predator in Africa. So we have those people around Africa. Who have done these things, but my only problem is local support. You see, when you have, as a Nigerian, if I am in conflict with China, and the Chinese government decide to throw its weight against me, probably my country would just say, well, you're on your own. Anything that happens to you, you just manage it like that. But that wouldn't be the same if it happens to an American, right? Or that wouldn't be the same if I hold an American passport, The American people will say, no, that's an American citizen. So most times, even though when these artists try to be critical, they're also very, very cautious, because in the long run, the government might not come out for them, except the West also steps in to say, oh, you're trying to oppress somebody now, So I think that's also a factor to consider.
A great question. So, I mean, in terms of, I guess, the music videos, I was just talking with the audience members. Like, you could hear the music and not have any idea of what the music video is about. I mean, I guess that's the case with music videos in general these days. But it is kind of this space, as well as the films, which were not favorable, I would say, necessarily to the Chinese investment projects. Again, kind of in the TV show, it was about entrenching existing political connections and in some ways patriarchy, because the whole film, Nigerian patriarchy, because the whole film was about a Nigerian woman politician, which is extremely rare in Nigeria in general. And so it was kind of a way to talk about local, critiquing local politics, as well as how Chinese intersections might exacerbate those dynamics. So that certainly, I think, is a space right now of critique. And I think the cartoonists, satirists, the ones that I'm familiar, like the images that I've seen, I think also bring really interesting dimensions of gender and race to the forefront. So we think about geopolitics, it shows us how we think about geopolitics, not just as kind of two nation states or whatever, but through artists' work, they really, through metaphors, through stand-ins or whatever, they really, needing to visually shortcut those things, remind us how those things are gendered. So I know, like the Kenyan artist, I believe, the one that you're referring to, I know Mingwei Huang has done a really great paper looking at, who's a gender studies scholar, looking at kind of gender sexualized dynamics of those paintings, essentially, and representations of both Africa, in that case, as particularly effeminate, and China as masculine in that case. But I think, brings up, all these other questions that can be very difficult sometimes to capture when you just have kind of state-to-state interactions or thinking about the government at that kind of macro or abstract level. So it's not a definitive answer, but just, some themes.
I didn't study this type of art in my current project, but I came across those artists and I also found it very fascinating and read other scholars' work on that. I think it's also speaks to just the broader field of kind of satirical production about China-Africa relations that's present on social media, and maybe in more kind of a ad hoc way, or less kind of beautiful productions that are widely circulated, but just individuals contributing different kind of satirical accounts or commentaries about the relations, sometimes using imagery that's also kind of trying to poke holes at the relationship in different ways, sometimes to very kind of mundane interactions, like just the humor that I found. It was just quite, striking, for example, somebody complaining about the quality of Chinese merchandise by articulating the story that they bought a pair of shoes that's made in China, and then the shoe melted on the way to the store. So they could just put it on, it already melted on the way home or something to the store. It was just like this very, kind of dramatic account of what Chinese products represent, and there are many, many accounts like that. So to me, I think this field, the overall kind of production of whether it's humor, satire, sarcasm, that I think very much is a huge component of this relationship, and looking at it through the artistic angle is, I think, very productive.
So kind of related to my broader work, which is more looking at economic formations in Nigeria and market politics. One of the interesting things about recent years is that you do see on occasion expulsion of foreign, oftentimes Chinese businessmen from different Nigerian market spaces across the country, and those are often organized by different market associations that have very strong control over market spaces in Nigeria. And some of that it gets splashed in the media, but it's not particularly sensational. I haven't seen it be particularly sensationalized. Part of it is I think there's a longer history in Nigeria of expulsions of different kinds of foreign actors from Nigerian commerce and other kinds of economic domains from the decolonial period onwards through indigenization and other later efforts. But it's interesting to think about how there are active, I think there were questions about if there were kind of Africans resisting or challenging these different kind of economic and media formations. And so it actually also got me thinking about discussions. I know in Nigeria sometimes they're called chinko goods, so like commodities that are Chinese made, seen as very shoddy. So even in the market you see a range of commodities. They're all imported, let's say, from China, but there's some that are chinko or Chinese quality and some that are like London made. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then, on the other spectrum, it's maybe made in the UK or something, which it isn't, but like there's a geopolitical hierarchy of grading commodities. And so, again, which might all actually be manufactured in China, right? So there's a way that in which it's I think it plays at, it challenges kind of thinking about what that geopolitical ordering is, and then also gets us to think about. I mean, I heard the term Chinko in a lot of different contexts, oftentimes very playful but very pejorative oftentimes. So like someone could call me Chinko, but if they knew me, they would never say that. And when I asked them about it, they'd be like, "Oh, it's not offensive." But whenever they knew me, they would never say it again. Versus a term like Oibo or some kind of other white person or foreigner, that could be even said in a respectful, it's a much more versatile term. So there's kind of interesting ways that Chineseness, and particularly through the commodity quality, is a way for people to express kind of satire or critique in a way that's both playful but also very serious.
So Vivian's last comment kind of leads me into the last two questions that I have that link to kind of race, kind of engagement on the ground, but also kind of power dynamics. So, and again, this is kind of targeted first at Vivian, but Maria and Emeka are both welcome to join in and give your thoughts. But I think certainly in your presentation, focusing on Nigerian kind of uptake, if you will, of martial arts and other kinds of Asian aesthetics, in some ways changes the conversation and moves the power or control of these narratives to African creators and possibly to African audiences, right? If creators are looking to please African audiences, and we all know that the size of Nollywood is substantial, it's a huge industry, but I think this really speaks to some of the power dynamics, and in China, Africa kind of research and literature, we've seen in the last several years a kind of turn in the focus of a lot of the research to focus more on African agency, and so I wonder how maybe your topic juxtaposes itself against some of the things that Maria and Emeka are focusing on in terms of Chinese media kind of penetration, if you will, of the African continent, right? And again, if we talk about gender dynamics or kind of sexual kind of metaphors, right? This is often the way that that certainly from the West, Chinese engagement with Africa is perceived, right? And it's not used quite as much, but certainly China as a predator or China as a neo-colonial power on the continent. And I think, the subject matter that Vivian has touched on really speaks to kind of a reversal, where the power and who's controlling the narrative and how China is and Chinese aesthetics or Asian aesthetics generally are utilized and kind of morphed for local purposes, right? For local audiences. So if you could speak to that.
So this is such a great question, and so I guess partly what I'm thinking of during this, and just from hearing you speak. Just kind of reminding me that I guess at least in this context, and I would say, is kind of up for debate probably globally, but there's not a Chinese control of a kind of dominant or global narrative through which you interpret China, what China is doing. There's attempts to shape that, but it's so clear that so much of it is lying outside of, let's say, Chinese state control, right? In terms of meaning making, narratives of what's going on the ground. And one of the things that really strikes me about Chinese engagement, let's say again, from what I know in terms of the Nigerian context, is there's a way in which China is so conscious of its kind of global image. And I don't mean that in a superficial way. I think it's seriously thinking about its relationship to these different geopolitical entities. And so like an incident like, let's say, anti-Black racial profiling in southern China. We saw that during COVID-19, that made a lot of global headlines. That happened as well during the Ebola epidemic in 2014. But what's interesting about those incidents of, let's say, anti-Black violence in southern China is that it actually escalates into like a geopolitical diplomatic issue in a way that you don't really see with, let's say, African countries whose populations experience racial discrimination in the West, for example. I don't know, think like post-Trump, different bands, right? Where the US government then actually engages meaningfully with an African government about that. But what we see in these different cases, at one level for that case, is that it forced a response from the Chinese state that was requested by top-level Nigerian officials at some point, right? And so it becomes, there's a possibility that that can become a public conversation, which is interesting in thinking about, I don't know, race and diplomacy outside of the West, between non-Western states in particular. I'm also thinking, when I lived in Lagos, for example, this is in the 2010s, 2014, 15, I know there were Chinese, particularly Guangzhou, raids on African populations for immigration status in southern China. And in Lagos, I still haven't figured out, I've only heard this from Chinese accounts, but Chinese people living there kept telling me, you should carry your passport around because state officials have been raiding the Chinatown and different Chinese communities, just forcing us to produce documentation as a reciprocal retaliation for the profiling of Africans in China. Which again, I don't think this is at level, these are two municipalities, not at a federal level, but there's at least this kind of consciousness or awareness that there is, I don't want to say mutuality, but a connection between profiling that could happen in these two different places, racial profiling, which is really interesting to think about. And so, I guess broadly also, in terms of the agency conversation, I would say these representations of China in Nigerian media still, especially the movie and film, it's they're still very much highlighting the overall extractive nature of the Nigerian economy towards a petrostate or mining, right? That is since colonial to post-colonial period has been an enduring condition. And so the representations show China less as a departure from that, but again, I think kind of an entrenchment or a transformation, but they're not fundamentally changing the structure of the Nigerian economy. Right now, Nigeria is a petrostate that exports oil traditionally towards the West. I think now the largest bilateral partner for oil trade is India, which is a global South state, but that's not transforming the global, the oil extraction industry necessarily in Nigeria in meaningful ways. Now, there might be some interesting things that might come out of that. I don't know. There's a possibility, but it's not an immediate departure from existing kind of colonial, neo-colonial structures of the Nigerian economy, and people are very aware of that, I think.
I just wanted to add a little bit in terms of the dynamics of race when it comes to public diplomacy and some of the instruments I've analyzed. I think when it comes to trainings as well, something that I've inferred from the interviews with the trainees or people who visit China on a regular basis, or at least once in their lifetime for these short and long-term trips, they also reflect on being treated in this exotified manner by Chinese citizens and in spontaneous encounters, really encountering this kind of racial profiling that maybe doesn't take place within official compounds. So when it's official events, they're treated with respect. They're in the top-level guests. But when it comes to stepping out of that official space and taking a metro or going to a grocery store, restaurant, they're experiencing the way in which that they're seen as the other, and oftentimes, based on the tone of their skin and so forth, there's all kinds of commentaries that they recall and retell, and sometimes they also see it from the state's perspective. If they enter China and they're questioned at the customs, sometimes treated as kind of unwelcome guests because the local officials at the customs just don't know who they are. They're not being as respectful towards them, and those incidents, they're deeply remembered and shared amongst each other, sometimes also with degree of kind of jokes and satire that, they just don't know us, or they don't know what Africa is, or they're not familiar, and when they become more familiar it's going to change, but other times in much more critical ways as well. So I think there is that kind of that tension that is underlined there when it comes to the attempts by the state to project one type of image, and then the actual encounters, the non-state encounters, are very different. And then even with that incident or I don't know if we could call it incident or crisis in Guangzhou, which was what was interesting to me that Vivian, you mentioned how it kind of maybe could open up towards a conversation about race, but then it doesn't seem like the government really took up that opportunity. They sort of quickly closed the crisis. Like Chinese government said that, it's mostly the fault of Guangzhou officials, local officials, which often happens in China, right? They blame local officials. They overextended themselves themselves. They were trying to manage the crisis. They overextended themselves and were too harsh. They went too extreme. And then we're going to change the policy quickly. But there wasn't really an open conversation about race per se or how things should shift in terms of these intricate matters. It was more kind of, I guess it wasn't really an apology. It was sort of a retreat and then, fixing the crisis as opposed to addressing the deep-seated issues, which I found really interesting, that maybe the space was there, but then it wasn't quite maybe taken up as an opportunity.
I think it's just to add a bit to what Maria has just said. Racial tension in China-African relations is a big issue. I would draw on the paper that you did with Alden, upstairs and downstairs of China-African relations. And I will go to the downstairs part of it. The upstairs is the political government to government, and the downstairs is the people to people. If we go to that segment, you find out that the tension is huge. In Kenya in 2015, we had the issue of the Chinese racist restaurant. It was repeated in Lagos in 2017. We have seen the Chinese New Year festival of racism, it didn't happen. It happened the first year, happened the second year, but it didn't happen this year. So we see this happen often. Then we saw what happened during COVID, but it didn't change anything. We have seen Chinese restaurant owners in Kenya flogging their African workers, So this whole racial thing is still there, but the problem is, Maria and the other speaker said, the Chinese government is not doing, they don't want to have any discussion about it. I don't think they are interested, I don't think they're interested. I have colleagues who studied in China and they tell me, well, it is true. Sometimes this will come to you and say, they want to touch if this thing is going to stain them. So these things are there. But what I would suggest is there should be conversation around this thing. How does it work? People in China should also know, because whether they know and they don't care, I wouldn't want to. I don't know. I have seen a video of a Chinese contractor in Uganda. I think he bidded for a contract and lost. And maybe he bribed the Ugandan minister, the Chinese. Maybe there were some underhand transactions, for him to get the contract, and he didn't get it. So when he didn't get it, he went to meet the minister in Uganda, and then held the minister, was trying to strangulate the minister. Yeah, I could look for the video and it's there. And then the minister's aide were saying, do you know he's a minister of the Ugandan government. You are dragging like this, So they carried the Chinese man. Two of them carried him away and threw him inside the truck and took him. So this issue of downstairs is very, very problematic. Whether it's going to get better tomorrow, I don't know. Maybe we hope the introduction of Chinese digital satellite TV will help that, Let's see how it goes. Thank you so much.
I wanted to just have one more kind of round to stick with this topic of race and perceptions and relations. And I'm going to start this question with some funny anecdotes based on my experience of being lived and worked in South Africa and Johannesburg, but kind of around the country for almost a dozen years or so. And I think in some respects, these experiences that I'm going to tell you about kind of really reflect a lot of the fluidity and the changes over time. So my first kind of job in South Africa was in the development sector, and I was working on a rural development project, doing research, participatory research, up in northern province in South Africa, and this was I was located in a village where there were very few non-Pedi speaking people. So this was all of kind of Pedi people. There was very little contact. It was quite rural, and I remember walking into the village with a couple of the local researchers who I had hired to do this field research for me. And all of these little kids started gathering around me, and they started shouting, "Bold and the Beautiful," like the American soap opera, which is filled with blonde, blue-eyed people, and there's never, ever been anyone who looked like me in Bold and the Beautiful. And yet, that was their perception of me, because clearly I had straight hair and whiter skin than they had, right? And I was basically called white, which was shocking to me as an Asian American who grew up in Los Angeles. Kind of fast forward just a couple years, and I was in a taxi with a Zulu taxi driver, and it was the holidays. I was asking him if he was going to go back home, and he said, yes, do you have children? Yes, he had thumped his chest. He had 10 kids. He was very proud of that, right? And then he looked at me through the rearview mirror, and he said, and you? Are you married? I said, yes. And he says, and your husband? And he paused for a second to try to ask me, to try to figure out how he was going to ask me this, right? But he said, your husband, does he look like you? And I said, no, actually, my husband looks like you. And he nearly got in a car accident. This is kind of engagements that I've had. My husband is tall, African American development consultant type. In his office, I went to fetch him late at night, and several times, and the 2 security guards that were in the building after hours stopped me and said, where are you going? It's 8 o'clock. I said, I'm going to fetch my husband. And they said, where? And I said, he works at Ebony Consulting. And they looked at me again, and they said, but everyone who works at Ebony is black. And I said, yes. And he said, which one's your husband? So I said, and so they let me through. The very next time I went, and this was like 2 or 3 weeks later, they pulled me aside because now we were buddies, and they said, hey, we have something to ask you. And they said, come teach us some karate. I said, I don't know karate. And they said, you're lying to us? They said, everyone in your culture knows karate. Teach us something. And they were just so insistent, right? So, and then one last anecdote, because one of you said something about racial profiling, but as every single trip where I was returning from Hong Kong or China to South Africa, I was pulled over by customs. There's a degree of racial profiling, so if you look like you're Asian and you're coming from Asia, you might be smuggling something, and so my luggage was all checked. In another similar incident, I was doing field research. This was back in 2008, 2009. Was driving around the country trying to find small Chinese traders in small towns in the Free State Province in South Africa. And I was in a vehicle with several other Asian women and my small daughter at the time, and I was pulled over by the cops just randomly, and they was clearly looking for a bribe, because in South Africa, if you're Chinese or if you look Chinese, you're a soft target for corrupt officials, and in every single interview that I did with Chinese migrants in the country, every one of them had experienced some type of crime or been extorted by corrupt officials. So I tell these anecdotes in part because they're entertaining, but also just to, I guess, ask our panelists to reflect a little bit more about how Asians, Chinese in particular, but anyone who's Asian, how they're seen in Africa, and whether or not this has changed in the last 20 years. I mean, we've heard about the incidents of the ways in which Africans in China have been treated in the past, but I'm curious now about the other side of things. And one last kind of little anecdote to end my question or opening up this discussion is, so as a sociologist and as a migration specialist, there's the kind of literature that talks about significant other, right? Who are the significant others? And in most African countries and throughout African history, the significant other has been the white European colonial power, right, or a white American. In some of these rural areas now, I hear from my white development practitioner friends that they're often identified as Chinese, that there are so many Chinese on the continent now working in rural, remote areas, particularly on mining and construction projects, that they are now the significant others. So white people can then follow in their footsteps to those areas and be identified as Chinese, which is a complete shift. And that started happening already 10 years ago. So just to add that to the mix. I don't know, Vivian, do you want to start?
Quickly, in terms of my own kind of ethnographic research experience, working in Nigeria and markets, there were oftentimes other Asian women there who were married to Nigerians. I mean, if I was around Lagos, like random people would stop me and be like, "Are you Malaysian? My sister-in-law is Malaysian," or like, "Are you Japanese? My sister-in-law is Japanese." Whatever. So you get a sense that just from walking around, and so when I was in these markets, people often just assumed I was someone's wife / potential business partner. And so there's a different kind of pervasive. I guess this would also vary drastically by context as well, but certainly in Nigeria with a lot of commercial mobility, and in Nigeria that being a very gendered dynamic, so largely men coming from Nigeria towards the global south, whereas when you look at kind of some of the francophone countries like DRC or Angola, Mozambique, it's a lot more kind of middle-aged women who are post-married going out. There's different dynamics according to place, but again in Nigeria where there's kind of highly mobile men and young men across those sites. And so in terms of Asian racialization, yeah, it's again like kind of gendered. There's even if I spoke Pidgin or something, people ask if I'm half caste or like basically if I was mixed somehow with Nigerian, because you also see there's been a lot of in the last few decades really Nigerians who are intermarrying with a whole range of people. So it is a shifting territory, I would say, in terms of racialization. And the two terms I mentioned with kind of Chinko and Oyinbo, I would be called both. So both kind of foreigner, broader category of whiteness, sometimes specific. And I think that does track to Asian racialization in this context. I think sometimes broadly in the continent. Both, yes, there's a distinct history, consciousness of Asia, Asianness, but also it's still linked with foreignness and whiteness in certain ways, in important ways, I think, economically, in terms of commerce, etc. And then just kind of a random thing I was thinking of, circulating a lot during my fieldwork since the 2010s onwards was basically every summer I was abroad, what was circulating in international news media were basically incidents of US police brutality against black people. So like this is whether I was in China or Dubai or in Nigeria, you would see and hear people talk about like protests in Ferguson, Missouri, or this is, I guess, pre-Black Lives Matter as kind of a coherent movement, but you would definitely see every summer in the United States, like the rulings around Trayvon Martin's killer, right, et cetera. So these became, I think this is something in the last 10 years in particular, but there is an international media sphere in which the US really gains international prominence through the protests that are happening socially. And this is covered by like, not just Chinese state media, but like Al Jazeera or like any of the other, basically non-Western media outlets. You see it really play a prominent role. And they came up in interviews as well. As Chinese American people would ask me, "Oh, you're American too?" Like, there's one time I wrote about this in my dissertation. I haven't yet written it up, but for the book. But a Nigerian guy just turned to me. He's like, "So what happened to George?" And I had to like think. I was like, "Who's George? Like, do we know a George? Like, I don't remember George." And then I realized he was talking about George Zimmerman from the United States who had killed Trayvon Martin, and it was a case around that time. So he just was like casually asking me, "What happened to George?" I was like, "Well, nothing happened to George, honestly." And so it's like the level to which people are familiar with these cases is also important, thinking about also what it means to be black in the United States, but also globally, because these stories were circulating amongst Nigerians in social media alongside media stories about anti-black African xenophobic violence in South Africa, or like incidents with Nigerians in Malaysia, India, UAE. So all these places where you do have anti-Black racism manifesting in different ways, and people are making these connections in their minds, whether or not they were leaving Nigeria or not. So I kind of think of that as, yeah, I don't know how it's transformed exactly, but I do think there is a shift, and at least in the last 10 years of thinking about race as this kind of transnational phenomena, which actually I think pre-existed the last 10 years, but was certainly heightened in the last 10 years because of the way that international news media has been kind of covering different issues.
To build a little bit on this really interesting points, the one on the exposure to pre-existing, I guess, BLM movement, but all the anti-Black violence in African countries, I found it also fascinating to observe how U.S. Embassy sometimes co-opts some of these events and narratives, but also the protest movement itself to highlight that there is an open discussion about race in America and that we're self-critical. So I observed some of these educational initiatives in actually the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia, where they were showing the Gambino video. And people were watching it. Students from Ethiopia were watching it, and the interlocutor, who's a white American guy, was talking about how we have all these problems, kind of acknowledging that we have these problems, but not going into too much detail, and then saying, but the good thing is we can talk about it. So we're actually self-reflective. So it was an interesting kind of twist on this theme, which I don't know if people bought into it and have a chance to speak to the students. I think they were actually seeing the video for the first time, so they were a bit shocked by the video, which was really exposing the police brutality. And it was really, extremely well produced. And I think they were just shocked to see the whole thing. And they were very young high school students. But I was also interested in this particular interlocutor sort of using that theme in a way that sort of attempts to, I guess, acknowledge it, but sort of softly, and then shift right into more I don't know if it's congratulatory, but kind of a positive messaging. And I've heard this message a lot from U.S. Embassy officials, like, we're self-critical, we're self-reflective, like, you would never be able to talk about this in China, right? So comparing themselves to China as kind of being so closed, and the U.S. is open, therefore we're kind of better off in the evolution of, I guess, bad things. So that was just something that came to mind from that point, but also just the idea of, the racialization kind of flow going the other way, right? We talked about the extortion examples. I've also experienced that as a passenger in a car with Chinese interlocutors and colleagues, friends who were stopped by police just frequently, and they were showing to me how you just get stopped all the time. And at some point, it was a very comical example of somebody had a box in the car, and the police officer said, "Can I see that box?" So it was just kept pointing at the box, and it just made no sense because obviously you can carry a box in your own car. But then, he looked at it, and eventually he didn't ask for a bribe. But, the individual who was with me said, look, that's what we experience all the time. It's just very absurd kind of ways of being stopped and asked and questioned and made feel very quite uncomfortable. So there was a lot of resentment that I guess I came across just through my research. And I think the other part that was interesting to me that came through in the field work was also the stereotyping that goes in the other direction, and in particular the stereotyping about acrobatic culture that sort of describes the Chinese, workers and people who they encounter, and the rumor of prison labor being sent over, from China, and they're all prisoners, and they're working in Ethiopia in this particular case as to repay for their crimes. So this rumor of prison labor I found to be really pervasive, and I also encountered this in China in the bigger context of different participants coming from across Africa, so not only Ethiopia, that they brought this up, and there was actually a big debate. It was in Beijing, and somebody pushed back and said this is not true. Actually, this person was also African, but then the participants didn't buy into this kind of empirical sort of evidence that said, no, it's really definitely true. So there was this interesting discussion about this prison labor rumor, and maybe it already faded, but at least a few years ago it was still going strong. So.
Especially on Vivian's point about immigration exploitation of Asian people, especially in Nigeria, you will find that immigration officers in Nigeria, they're always on the lookout for foreigners, especially, and funny enough, the foreigners are segregated, right? They will not go after Americans and British or maybe other Western people, but they're looking. Yeah. So, but they will be on the lookout for Chinese, Indians, and just name them, anybody from Asia. So what they do is, it's funny enough, they were not sent by the government. But, because they have everybody's data. So they know when your visa is expiring. So once they know, they come and then they hit you, then you give them bribe. So you see, they're not doing it for national development. Yeah, I don't know if they're not doing it because it is in the interest of the Nigerian government. Yes. So in your mind, you could think they are doing their job. No, they are just exploiting. So sometimes, I mean, I used to have a friend of mine who was working for an Indian company say, well, these guys say, oh, once they are looking for money, they say, oh, where is the foreigner? Say, okay, these people, oh yeah, let's go look for them. So they just come and pick them up. Hey, say, okay, bring this. I say, okay, hey, we don't want to go back to, we don't want to go. So they bring money, they bring bribe. They say, okay, take your time. Okay, go back. They leave them and they go again. So you see the approach now, because they can't do that to Americans. They will not do that to Western people, but they will do that to Chinese and Indians because they think either they have this perception because they think, oh, the Chinese people will overstay, or they will not care. The Indians will the same distance, so we'll just go after them and collect money. If you go to the American, they will likely call the embassy, and all that. So it's
Further questions? Then
this opportunity to ask one question.
Sure.
I'm curious about the potential for unintended network effects that come through BRNN or through some of these trainings, right? You end up having groups of Africans in some type of experience of exposure to China. And perhaps, we don't know what the actual efficacy of any of these things are, but are there effects in terms of kind of separate people-to-people relations that happen between the African communities who are there? And does that in some way generate some kind of agency? Is there exchange of information, things like of that nature?
For the BRNN, I would presume that because it is managed by People's Daily in China, even though you have other media organizations. So I would presume a form of greater engagement between the Chinese media organizations and the African media organizations. That's partnership, and this could result in sharing of information. It could also result in there could be an opportunity for media capture. It's a possibility. Then sorry that I have to jump into your media exchanges, right? But because that's your own terrain. But I mean, but one thing that the media training would do, they've started not many years ago. It's not up to, I don't think it's up to 1 decade or more when they started that. But give it like 20 years time. You have more journalists who have been trained in China holding leadership positions in media houses across Africa. Now, those journalists are the ones who make final decisions on content to be published and not to be published. So, because going to China also help them build, sources, help them build context about reporting on China. Because what most of them tell you is, well, you have not been to China. Tell their colleagues, you have not been to China, so you don't know anything about China. You can't say anything about it. We were there. Don't forget about what the Western media is telling you. We know what it is. That is just a lie. If you go to China, you realize that it's a different ballgame entirely. So in the long run, you are likely to have more, media actors who are very, very biased, towards China. That could happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I like this idea of unintentional network effects because I'm looking to explore this a bit deeper because I observed, anecdotally or just little glimpses of that in the research, in particular when it comes to the training experience that I'm like more long term. We just noticed that in this case this time is a bit less structured. People are not just kind of taken in and out of different rituals and settings, but they have time to hang out on their own and to explore China on their own. And oftentimes they do that together with other journalists or just other members of that particular cohort, just like they would, I guess, in any fellowship context in the US or elsewhere. So there is a lot of bonding that takes place as part of that. And I think this reinforcing of ties across different African countries and friendships that I think do outlast the training. They often connect on a very personal level. And I don't know how much of it is really in terms of kind of China-focused, strategic engagements or more so just human relations, but certainly a lot of them also share more cynical sentiments about their experience. For example, they would often make fun of the fact that they have to be constantly interviewed by Chinese media. It's like, hey, how many interviews have you done? And I've been approached so many times and I'm exhausted, I want to go home. So there was kind of also, I wouldn't call them bitter, just more kind of humorous, cynical sentiments about their time there, or sharing information about the red lines, like what should you ask, what you shouldn't ask from Chinese officials. They will share that information across that network, and as a result, know how to kind of engage with that system. So I guess one could see that as a form of reasserting control, that China is kind of indirectly enhancing this practices of self-censorship, but one could also see it as a form of survival and critical reflection, that there is agency in, kind of engaging in these experiences. They're not just kind of completely reshaping someone. People actually come out often more critical that they came in when it comes to China. So, and they share that critique amongst themselves and form different opinions and I think maybe more deeper insights to that engagement. The other kind of observation I had was from these sort of youth networks that were set up informally. China holds a lot of youth networks through the BRI, so the younger civil society leaders, not just journalists, but I think most of them are not journalists. They're in some NGO space. And then they set up a so-called China and ex-country kind of friendship association or media, a group that I think has really resonates also in the Mao period. It has historical sort of legacies, but they set up these informal groups and then they try to network with each other to see how their group is doing and how they get sources. And sometimes it's really about getting sources from Chinese embassy. So how did you get your sources? How did you get more money or more, ways to kind of engage? And they engage with China, they position themselves as more positive kind of pro-China relationship, but then in private settings, they often use that money to also have more reflective, critical discussions. And I found that they learn a lot from these networks that they form kind of without the Chinese embassy. It's just themselves, communicating through those connections through WeChat and other spaces. So maybe it kind of flows both ways, but I think it's a really interesting part of this analysis that also maybe speaks to other network effects. If you come to the US for training, I'm sure a lot of these connections outlast the experience and maybe, all kinds of sentiments transpire through those sort of interactions. So thank you very much for raising it.
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting morning. I still have a gazillion questions about the cartoons, but the one thing that sort of struck me about that is the selection process. So in these training programs and exchanges, the focus is it really exclusively on print media, or what is the role even of photojournalists and other forms of media representation in these exchanges? And then a separate question altogether. I've sort of been struck by, I don't know if it's an intentional atemporality, but sort of thinking about the role of history in these kinds of exchanges too. There didn't seem to be any sort of conscious nod towards, well, that was then and this is what we're building. There really doesn't seem to be an emphasis on change or in striking the narratives, and it's sort of striking the absence of trying to change historical narratives through these different networks of exchange. And I was just wondering if you might comment on that.
I think it goes across mediums. It's just the target, at least in my case, was of major news outlets. So it doesn't have to be a print media journalist. For instance, the Ethiopian News Agency, which is also part of the BRNN network that Emeka talked about, they also are frequent recipients of these fellowships, and they can work across different mediums, including visual, television, broadcasting, and print. So it's really kind of cuts across, and some of them are digital-only journalists who would focus more on the digital platforms. So I think they're really inclusive in terms of what kind of medium one is practicing, but more so focusing on just major media outlets. And in the case of Ethiopia, that focus more on state media, but I would also want to add that sometimes they did invite private media to participate, but they didn't want to accept it, which was interesting. Also, kind of example of, I guess one could call it resistance or pushback. That's a major private media that I engaged with in Ethiopia, their editors said no to the trainings from China, and they chose to go elsewhere, which mostly was, I think, was actually the UK where they went. So they were able to negotiate other programs for themselves. I think part of it is that they were very interested in professional norms and practices. They had pre-existing thoughts about what China is offering and what it represents in terms of media, and they found it to be kind of a waste of time. They said, we have so much to do. Why would we go to China for media training? But that was the only example I found of explicit rejection. They just didn't want to, they didn't accept it. But the state media journalists tend to accept it more readily as well. So maybe that's why there's more synergy in terms of that. And then on atemporality, I guess I wasn't sure if you mean that our presentations didn't quite touch on, or more that Chinese initiatives don't engage with the temporal aspect of their what they're doing. Yeah. So at least in terms of the diplomatic language, and also I think some of the media coverage, they do definitely have a temporal aspect of building on what they've been doing before. So oftentimes emphasizing that China has been a really important actor in the African context in terms of the anti-colonial resistance movements, and really China has always been a friend, and it was always standing with Africans across these historical turbulent moments and times. So positioning itself very much as a developing country, also that China has long been a developing country, even though one would argue maybe it no longer should be considered as such, but still positioning itself as kind of, aligning with these developmental narratives that also have a much longer historical past. So we see kind of a linear, I think in some ways, continuity across these kind of temporal invocations, at least in Chinese diplomatic rhetoric, but less so kind of what are we doing that's very different. I didn't quite see this emphasis on difference, more so we're building on something. We've been here a very long time, therefore we have trust, we have inherent kind of position here that's more trustworthy than what the West has been doing. Because look at what the West, the experience with the West is much different. So there's a kind of emphasis on distinctions that's being placed here, but definitely there's a temporal element to how they are articulating the role on the continent.
Quickly, I love this question about history and something I've been thinking through as I've been working through some archival work as well. But one thing that really strikes me, I mean, I guess Ethiopia's had a longer diplomatic, closer history with China, you know, and again, it varies kind of country to country in terms of what they can even mobilize from their past in terms of some kind of deep relationship. I know Nigeria just celebrated its, I guess, 50th anniversary of kind of official post-Civil War ties with the Chinese state in the 70s. So there's different ways, though, you see these histories come up. I think in really important ways, and I think feature like very interestingly in particularly South-South formations. So like even the Belt and Road, I guess, Silk Road, right? It's a reference to an ancient past that less included Africa initially, very much, of course, like Eurasia and the South China Seas, kind of Indian Ocean connections. But certainly, you know, I know in terms of Turkish, different kinds of Muslim aid across northern Africa, particular parts of they've highlighted kind of Ottoman connections from the past, Indian Ocean circulations as well. I just was at the University of Nairobi, and there was a recent plaque. There's an old library that's been there that was built during Julius Nyerere's time at the East African University that's named after Mahatma Gandhi, their kind of major library there. And then there's like a recent plaque just from the last 5 years of the Indian government recently came and like revisited and kind of anointed or something that site. So you see like these interesting connections, particularly these South-South states that they're trying to mobilize older histories of anti-colonialism or non-aligned movement histories, sometimes for contemporary capitalist projects. So it's not necessarily like, I'm not saying that it's a continuity in any means, but they certainly use history, I think, a lot and all the time. And then I had one more point. Now I'm forgetting it. Something about domestic. Did you say something about domestic? Anyway, yeah, I'll come back to me. But I also just want to say the unintended network effects, I think is such an interesting way to put it, because I feel like in some ways the main goals of the Chinese and Africans in China research networks is we're thinking about these larger state projects or, you know, using those as context, but what are all these other non-intended state, you know, outcomes of these different kinds of engagements? I just thought it was a really nice way to summarize some of the, I think, impulses and attempts of a lot of researchers who are working on this subject.
Just a bit of building on what Maria and Vivian have said. In terms of the Chinese media exchanges, I think in West Africa, whether it tends to be varied. You know, some journalists are nominated through their media organizations. Some are nominated by the local Chinese embassy. Some are nominated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in their countries. You know, so in some instances, the local Chinese embassy has a partnership with a journalist association. So the association nominates journalists to go for this training. So you can see it sometimes is very depending on where you are. So I mean that's what we saw in West Africa. Then in terms of historical changing historical narrative, I think what you usually see is this win-win thing. You know, it's always been derived from the Bandung Conference. You know, win-win. We're in this so that China and Africa win together. You know, so it's kind of a mutual partnership. So they tend to frame this through these trainings also. So I mean, the journalists also think, well, China is doing this because I mean they want Africa to also, you know, become that good country. You know, because I mean China is bringing development to Africa, unlike the Western, you know, countries, so to speak. So I mean, it's all about win-win too in the long run. Yeah, that's what I see.
We're actually at time. I want to thank our in-person audience so much for sticking with us. It has been a long morning. This idea of a symposium, more than just a one-off kind of one speaker or one panel, is an experiment in some ways to see, but it's also a way to kind of have a slightly longer conversation and really think through and talk through some of these issues. So I really appreciate all of you being here with us, and if you can join me in thanking our speakers again. And I'm going to ask Riley to come up, and she was going to, Eleanor, you were going to say a couple words about future events, and then we'll.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was a great partnership with the Africa-China Initiative and the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. And it was part of our China and the Global South event series that we started. We've had a couple previous events, and we have a couple more coming up. One will be next week on China and Latin and South America. And then we'll have another one next month unpacking other aspects of the China-Africa relationship, looking more at aid and investment tools, and then some future events. But thank you so much. This was really a fantastic symposium. Thanks.